Assalamualaikum and hello sir. I'm Sarah Liu and I present about the Flakiness index test and Elongation index test. Flakiness index test. The aggregate particle is considered flaky if its thickness is less than 0.6 times the mean sieve size of the size fraction. Flaky aggregate is not desired due to improper orientation of aggregate particle during mixing and breaks during compaction, thus affects load carrying capacity of the asphalt mix. Objective: to determine the flakiness index of aggregate sample. The flakiness index test requires the following apparatus: thickness gauge, BS test sieve, mechanical sieve shaker, tray, and balance. Procedure: initially, weight each of the individual sieve size used in the analysis. Secure a representative sample of aggregate. Conduct sieve analysis on approximately 2 kilograms of aggregate sample with using the selected BS test sieve size. Discard all aggregate retained on the 63.0 mm BS test sieve and all aggregate passing the 6.30 mm BS test sieve. Weight each of individual size fractions retained on the sieves other than 63 mm BS test sieve and store them in separate trays with their size marked on the trays. Sum the measures for all size fractions M1. Calculate the individual percentage retained aggregate on each of the various sieves. Discard any aggregates which the mass is 5% or less of mass M1. Record the mass remaining M2, which is the total weight of the aggregate excluding the weight of the size of less 5% of weight. The gauge. Select the thickness gauge appropriate to the size fraction under test and gauge each particle separately by hand. Refer to Table 1 of Highway Laboratory Test Manual. Combine and weigh all the particles passing the gauge M3. Calculate the flakiness index. The flakiness index shall be reported to the nearest whole number. Elongation index test. The aggregate particle is considered elongated if its length is more than 1.8 times the mean dimension of the size fraction. Elongated aggregate is not desired due to improper orientation of aggregate particle during mixing and breaks during compaction, thus reduce the strength of the asphalt mix. The objective is to determine the elongation index of aggregate sample. The apparatus is blank gauge, BS test sieve, mechanical sieve shaker, tray, and balance. The procedure is: initially weigh each of the individual sieve size used in the analysis. Secure a representative sample of aggregate. Conduct sieve analysis on approximately 2 kg of aggregate sample with using the selected BS test sieve size. Discard all aggregate retained on the 50 mm BS test sieve and all aggregate passing the 6.30 mm BS test sieve. Weight each of individual size fractions retained on the sieves other than 50 mmBs test sieve and store them in separate trays with their size marked on the trays. Sum the masses for all size fractions M1. Calculate the individual percentage retained aggregate on each of the various sieves. Discard any aggregate which the mass is 5% or less of mass M1. Record the mass remaining M2. Using the gauge, select the length gauge appropriate to the size fraction under test and gauge each particle separately by hand. Refer to Table 2 of Highway Laboratory Test Manual. Combine and weight all elongated particles passing the gauge M3. Calculate the elongation index. The elongation index shall be reported to the nearest whole number.